May 23, 1944, 140 miles southeast of Saipan, Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander Shichiko Ariyama sat in the cramped control room of the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-184, watching the depth gauge needle hover at 45 meters. Around him, 70 men breathed recycled air that was growing steadily more foul with each passing hour. The temperature inside the hull had climbed to 95 degrees Fahrenheit despite being underwater. Sweat dripped from every surface. "Time submerged?" Ariyama asked his executive officer. 7 hours, 40 minutes, Captain." Ariyama nodded grimly. They were approaching the limit. Japanese submarines could remain submerged approximately 8 to 10 hours before the batteries died and the air became too poisonous to breathe. After that, they had no choice but to surface, expose themselves to enemy aircraft, and run the diesel engines to recharge batteries and refresh the air. "Prepare to surface," he ordered. "Lookouts to the conning tower. Be ready to dive immediately if aircraft are spotted." The crew moved quickly through well-practiced procedures. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability when Japanese submarines were forced by technological limitations to expose themselves to an enemy that owned the sky. I-184 broached the surface at dusk, hoping darkness would provide some protection. Diesel engines roared to life, pulling fresh air through the hull, charging batteries that would allow perhaps another 8 hours submerged. The crew knew they had perhaps 3 hours on the surface before dawn made them too vulnerable. Then they'd dive again and repeat the cycle. This was how Japanese submarines operated. A rhythm of dive, hide as long as possible, surface out of necessity, desperately hope no aircraft were nearby, charge and breathe, dive again before being destroyed. 300 miles to the east, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey commanded the American submarine USS Barb on her 9th war patrol. His boat had been submerged for 46 hours. The crew was tired, the air was stale, but the batteries still showed 35% charge. They could stay down another 12 hours if needed, maybe more if they ran absolutely silent. When Japanese destroyers passed overhead hunting for submarines, Barb simply went deeper and waited. When aircraft appeared, Barb stayed down. There was no desperate need to surface every 8 hours, no forced exposure at predictable intervals. American submarines could hide until conditions were perfect for surfacing, or stay submerged indefinitely if enemy activity made surfacing too dangerous. Lieutenant Commander Fluckey didn't surface until 52 hours after his last dive, not because he had to, but because tactical conditions finally favored it. When he did surface, it was at a time and place of his choosing, not dictated by battery exhaustion. This endurance differential, 48+ hours American versus 8 hours Japanese, was one of the most decisive technological gaps of the Pacific Submarine War. It determined who could hide and who was forced to expose themselves, who could wait for perfect attack opportunities and who had to surface on schedule regardless of enemy presence, who controlled when and where they were vulnerable, and who operated on a predictable, exploitable pattern. This is the story of how American submarine endurance advantage destroyed the Japanese submarine force more effectively than any weapon, how staying underwater twice as long meant controlling the terms of engagement, and how Japanese submariners, among the bravest and most skilled in the world, died in massive numbers not because they couldn't fight, but because they were forced to surface when American submarines could stay hidden. When submarine warfare began in World War I, endurance underwater was measured in hours, usually single-digit hours. Submarines were essentially surface ships that could temporarily submerge to avoid detection or launch attacks. Extended underwater operations were impossible because of two fundamental limitations: battery capacity and air quality. By the late 1930s, as navies prepared for another world war, both Japan and America understood that submarine effectiveness depended heavily on how long boats could remain submerged. A submarine forced to surface frequently was vulnerable to aircraft and surface hunters. A submarine that could stay down for extended periods could operate with near impunity in enemy-controlled waters. Both nations approached this challenge with the same basic technology: electric motors powered by large battery banks for submerged operations, diesel engines for surface running and battery charging. But their implementations diverged dramatically in ways that would prove decisive. Japan entered World War II with one of the largest and most sophisticated submarine fleets in the world. The Imperial Japanese Navy operated approximately 63 submarines in December 1941, with more under construction. These ranged from small coastal boats to the massive I-400 class submarines, the largest built by any nation until the 1960s. Japanese submarine design emphasized surface performance. The I-class fleet submarines could make 23 knots on the surface exceptionally fast. They had ranges exceeding 14,000 nautical miles, allowing operations across the entire Pacific without refueling. They carried powerful torpedo armament, including the Type 95 oxygen torpedo that left no wake and had twice the range of American weapons. In surface characteristics, Japanese submarines were world-class. In submerged endurance, they were severely limited. The typical Japanese fleet submarine, like the I-15 class, carried battery banks that could power submerged operations for approximately 8 to 10 hours at cruising speed. If the submarine slowed to minimum steerage, barely moving, it might extend this to 12 hours. Beyond that, the batteries were exhausted and the boat had to surface. More critically, air quality deteriorated rapidly. Japanese submarines used relatively primitive air purification systems. Carbon dioxide built up quickly in the enclosed hull. After 8 hours submerged, the air became dangerously contaminated, high in carbon dioxide, depleted of oxygen, and filled with toxic fumes from battery off-gassing. Crew members would experience headaches, nausea, and impaired judgment. Beyond 10 hours, the air became life-threatening. Sailors would collapse, decision-making became unreliable. The submarine had to surface not just to recharge batteries, but to save the crew from suffocation. This created an operational rhythm that Japanese submariners accepted as the natural limitation of submarine warfare. You dove at dawn to avoid aircraft. You remained submerged as long as possible, typically 8 hours. You surfaced at dusk, ran diesels to charge batteries and refresh air for 3 to 4 hours. You dove again before dawn, repeat daily. This pattern was predictable, it was exploitable, and it meant Japanese submarines were forced to surface on a schedule regardless of whether conditions were safe. American submarine design took a different approach. The United States Navy's fleet submarines, particularly the Gato, Balo, and Tench classes that formed the backbone of the Pacific Submarine Force, were optimized not for surface speed but for submerged endurance. American fleet submarines were larger than their Japanese counterparts. A Gato-class submarine displaced 1,525 tons surfaced versus a Japanese I-15 class at 2,190 tons, but the American design dedicated far more internal volume to batteries and environmental systems. The Gato class carried 252 battery cells, massive lead-acid batteries weighing approximately 240 tons total. This was nearly double the battery capacity of equivalent Japanese submarines. These batteries could power submerged operations for 48 hours at 2 knots. At absolute minimum power, just enough to maintain depth control and life support, an American submarine could remain submerged for 72 hours or more. But battery capacity was only part of the advantage. American submarines incorporated sophisticated air purification systems that Japanese boats lacked. Carbon dioxide scrubbers using chemicals to remove CO2 from the air. oxygen generation systems that could supplement the hull's air supply, ventilation designs that ensured air circulated properly throughout the boat. These systems meant that even after 48 hours submerged, the air quality in an American submarine, while unpleasant, remained breathable and safe. Crew efficiency remained high. Commanders could make sound decisions. The submarine could stay down until tactical conditions favored surfacing, not because biological necessity forced it. The engineering philosophy difference was stark. Japan built submarines that performed brilliantly on the surface and accepted limited submerged duration as inevitable. America built submarines that treated submerged operations as primary and surface running as the vulnerable state to be minimized. This philosophical difference produced dramatic operational consequences that became apparent within weeks of the war starting. The first few months of the Pacific War seemed to validate Japanese submarine design. In December 1941 and January 1942, Japanese submarines operated aggressively in Hawaiian waters off the American west coast and throughout the Pacific. They sank merchant ships, shelled coastal facilities, and demonstrated that Japanese submarine force was a serious threat. But American submarine commanders quickly recognized their endurance advantage and began exploiting it systematically. The first recorded instance of an American submarine using extended endurance defensively occurred in February 1942. USS Gudgeon, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Elton W. Grenfell, was being hunted by Japanese destroyers near Midway. Grenfell took Gudgeon deep and rigged for silent running, shutting down all non-essential systems, having crew remain motionless, reducing power consumption to absolute minimum. Japanese destroyers circled overhead, dropping depth charges and using sonar to search. Grenfell knew from intelligence reports that Japanese submarines typically couldn't stay submerged more than 8 to 10 hours. He gambled that Japanese anti-submarine doctrine assumed American submarines had similar limitations. Gudgeon remained submerged, absolutely silent, for 36 hours. The Japanese destroyers, after persistent searching for approximately 12 hours, concluded the submarine had escaped and departed the area. When Gudgeon finally surfaced, she was alone in open ocean, having outlasted hunters who assumed no submarine could remain hidden that long. Grenfell's patrol report documented this evasion. His conclusion was prophetic. Enemy appears to search for submarines based on assumption of limited submerged duration. Extended patience underwater may be our greatest defensive weapon. This insight spread through the American submarine force. Commanders learned that when hunted, their best defense wasn't evasion at high speed, which drained batteries quickly, but rather deep hiding with minimum power consumption, outweighting hunters who operated on Japanese submarine performance assumptions. The pattern repeated throughout 1942 and 1943. American submarines hunted by Japanese anti-submarine forces would go deep, go silent, and wait, and wait, and wait, often for 30, 40, even 50 hours. Japanese hunters, after searches lasting 8-12 hours, would conclude the submarine had escaped and depart. The submarine would then surface safely and continue its patrol. This defensive advantage was valuable, but the offensive advantage proved even more decisive. Japanese submarines, forced to surface every 8 hours, had to choose surfacing times based on battery state rather than tactical opportunity. If your batteries were dying at noon, you surfaced at noon even if enemy aircraft were active. You had no choice. The alternative was suffocation and a dead boat sinking to the bottom. American submarines could choose when to surface based purely on tactical considerations. If aircraft were present during the day, American subs stayed down until nightfall. If enemy ships were nearby at night, American subs stayed submerged until the area cleared. They surfaced when and where it was safest, not when batteries dictated. This meant American submarines could operate in areas where Japanese submarines couldn't survive. Waters with constant air patrols were death traps for Japanese subs that had to surface predictably. American subs could lurk there for days, surfacing only during brief windows of opportunity. The operational statistics tell the story starkly. In 1942, during relatively equal phases of the war, Japanese submarine loss rates to aircraft were already notably higher than American rates. Approximately 15% of Japanese submarines lost were sunk by aircraft versus 8% for American submarines. By 1943, as Allied air patrols intensified, the gap widened dramatically. Japanese submarine losses to aircraft reached 28% of all losses. American losses to aircraft remained relatively constant at 10–12%. The difference was simple. Japanese submarines were forced to surface into air-patrolled areas on schedule. American submarines could stay down until aircraft departed. The human experience of this difference was profound. Japanese submariners described the psychological burden of the 8-hour cycle as one of the most stressful aspects of submarine warfare. Lieutenant Commander Toshio Kusaka, who survived the war after commanding several submarines, wrote in his memoir, "Every dive was a countdown to forced surfacing. You watched the battery indicator and the air quality gauge knowing that in 8 hours, regardless of what was happening above, you would have to surface. If enemy aircraft were present at that moment, you surfaced anyway. If destroyers were hunting, you surfaced anyway. The boat demanded it." This knowledge that you couldn't wait out danger, that danger might still be present when you had to surface, created constant anxiety. American submariners described an entirely different psychology. Lieutenant Commander Edward Beach, who commanded USS Toronto and later wrote extensively about submarine warfare, explained, "We controlled when we surfaced. If conditions were dangerous, we stayed down. The boat could outlast any search. This gave us psychological advantage. We weren't operating on enemy's timeline. We could be patient. Patience underwater often meant survival." This psychological difference affected everything from decision-making to crew morale. Japanese submarine commanders made decisions under time pressure, knowing they'd have to surface soon, forced rushed choices. American commanders could take time, wait for perfect opportunities, make decisions from position of control rather than necessity. The specific numbers behind American submarine endurance advantage came from multiple engineering factors, all documented in technical manuals and patrol reports. Battery capacity was the foundation. American Wahoo-class submarines carried 252 Exide battery cells arranged in 2 banks, 126 cells per bank. Each cell was massive, weighing approximately 1,650 pounds. The total battery weight was approximately 240 tons, roughly 16% of the submarine's surface displacement. These batteries could store approximately 1.5 megawatt-hours of electrical energy. At economical submerged cruising speed of 23 knots, power draw was approximately 751,000 kilowatts. Simple mathematics, 1,500 kilowatt-hours divided by 30 kilowatts equals 50 hours of operation. In practice, submarines rarely ran batteries to complete exhaustion. Maintaining reserve power for emergencies was critical. Typical practice was to surface when batteries reached 25–30% capacity. This meant 35–40 hours of practical submerged endurance at cruising speed. If a submarine slowed to bear steerage, just enough speed to maintain depth control and maneuver slowly, power consumption dropped to approximately 500 kilowatts. This extended endurance to 60–70 hours theoretically, 50–55 hours practically. And if a submarine went completely silent, lying on the bottom or drifting at minimum power, draw could be reduced to 200-300 kilowatts for life support only. Under these conditions, documented patrol reports show American submarines remaining submerged for 72+ hours. Japanese I-class submarines, by comparison, carried approximately 121-140 battery cells depending on specific class. Total battery capacity was roughly 750 kilowatt-hours, approximately half that of American submarines. Combined with less efficient electric motors and higher power consumption for given speed, this translated to 8–10 hours practical endurance. The air quality systems made the difference even more dramatic. American submarines used complex chemical air purification systems that Japanese submarines lacked or implemented poorly. The primary threat to air quality in submerged submarines was carbon dioxide buildup. 70 men breathing in an enclosed space produced approximately 1.5 cubic feet of carbon dioxide per hour per person, over 100 cubic feet per hour total. Without removal, CO2 concentration would reach dangerous levels within 6–8 hours. American submarines used CO2 scrubbers, chemical systems that passed air through tanks filled with soda, lime, or other alkaline compounds that absorbed carbon dioxide. These systems could process the entire hull's air volume every 2–3 hours, maintaining CO2 at safe levels for extended periods. Additionally, American submarines carried oxygen generation systems, typically chlorate candles that, when burned, released pure oxygen. This allowed replenishment of oxygen consumed by the crew without surfacing. Between CO2 removal and oxygen generation, American submarines could maintain breathable atmosphere for 48+ hours. Japanese submarines had primitive scrubbing systems that were less efficient and had limited chemical supply. After 8 hours submerged, CO2 levels would reach 2–5%, the point where crew members experienced headaches, nausea, and impaired judgment. Japanese doctrine called for surfacing before CO2 exceeded 3%, which would cause severe physiological impairment. The combination, double the battery capacity plus superior air management, gave American submarines roughly 5–6 times the practical submerged endurance of Japanese submarines, and this translated directly into operational effectiveness. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the endurance advantage dramatically in combat conditions. During this massive carrier battle, both American and Japanese submarines attempted to penetrate the opposing fleet's screen to attack carriers. Japanese submarine I-184, the boat we met at the beginning, was among several Japanese submarines deployed to intercept American carriers. Commander Ariyama positioned his boat along the estimated American approach route and submerged at dawn on June 19th, waiting to detect the enemy fleet. American destroyers detected I-184 on sonar and began a persistent depth charge attack. Ariyama took the submarine deep and rigged for silent running. For 8 hours, the Japanese submarine dodged depth charges, maneuvered quietly, and attempted to evade the hunters. But after 8 hours, with batteries depleting and air quality deteriorating, Ariyama faced the impossible choice every Japanese submarine commander dreaded. The destroyers were still hunting, sonar pings echoed through the hull constantly, but the submarine had to surface. The crew was struggling to breathe. The batteries showed 15% charge, not enough for extended evasion. At hour 8 and 15 minutes, with the crew's condition critical, Ariyama ordered prepare to surface. He knew what would happen. The submarine would blow ballast tanks, breach the surface, and be immediately visible to the destroyers that had been hunting it. The crew would try to man the deck gun and fight, but against multiple destroyers with overwhelming firepower, the outcome was predetermined. I-184 surfaced at 4:47 p.m. Destroyer gunfire hit the conning tower within 30 seconds. The submarine was sunk within 4 minutes with all hands lost. Ariyama and his entire crew died because technological limitations forced them to surface into a hunting ground they couldn't escape. The same day, the American submarine USS Cavella was also being hunted by Japanese destroyers after attacking carriers. Commander Herman Kostler took Cavella deep and silent. Japanese destroyers dropped depth charges for 12 hours, longer than any Japanese submarine could have remained submerged. Kostler waited, the boat remained silent. The crew conserved air and power. After 16 hours of continuous searching, the Japanese destroyers, their own fuel running low and likely assuming no submarine could remain submerged so long, departed the area. Cavella stayed down an additional 6 hours to ensure the Japanese were truly gone. After 22 hours submerged, nearly 3 times what Japanese submarines could achieve, Cavella surfaced safely, charged batteries, and continued her patrol. She would later sink the carrier Shikaku, one of the 6 carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor. 2 submarines, similar tactical situations, radically different outcomes. One forced to surface into danger by technological limitation. One able to wait out danger through superior endurance. One destroyed with all hands. One survived to continue fighting. This pattern repeated throughout the Pacific Submarine War. American submarines hunted by anti-submarine forces routinely stayed submerged 30-50 hours, outwaiting hunters and surfacing when safe. Japanese submarines, forced to surface on schedule regardless of danger, died in disproportionate numbers. The statistics are stark. From 1940 to 1945, Japan lost 130 submarines, approximately 68% of all submarines commissioned. Of these losses, 42 were sunk by aircraft. Approximately 32% of all Japanese submarine losses came from being caught on the surface by aircraft. American losses tell a different story. The United States lost 52 submarines total, approximately 18% of all submarines commissioned. Of these, only 6 were confirmed sunk by aircraft while surfaced, roughly 12% of American submarine losses. The endurance advantage manifested in loss rates. Japanese submarines were nearly 3 times as likely to be caught and destroyed on the surface as American submarines, directly attributable to being forced to surface more frequently and at predictable intervals. But the advantage wasn't just defensive. Superior endurance enabled offensive tactics that Japanese submarines couldn't match. American submarines developed a hunting pattern called lifeguarding station, positioning along known enemy shipping routes, submerging and waiting. Sometimes for days. When enemy ships appeared, the submarine would attack from concealed position, then go deep and silent to evade counterattacks, remaining submerged as long as necessary to escape. USS Wahoo under Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton pioneered this approach. Morton would position Wahoo along Japanese convoy routes, submerge, and simply wait, sometimes for 24-36 hours. When a target appeared, Wahoo would attack aggressively, then disappear by remaining submerged through any counterattack. Wahoo's crew called it the patient hunt. Japanese submarines attempted similar tactics but were constrained by endurance. They couldn't wait days for targets. They had to surface every 8 hours regardless of whether targets had appeared. This forced them to patrol on the surface more, making them visible to aircraft and enemy ships. Their patrols were less patient, less deliberate, more rushed. The most dramatic demonstration of American endurance advantage was the practice of staying submerged in heavily patrolled enemy waters for extended periods. American submarines regularly operated in areas where Japanese submarines simply couldn't survive, waters with constant air coverage where any submarine forced to surface predictably would be destroyed within days. The best documented example was operations in the South China Sea and East China Sea during 1944-1945. These waters were under intense Japanese air patrol, hundreds of aircraft searching constantly for submarines. Japanese submarines that attempted to operate there were destroyed quickly because they had to surface every 8 hours. American submarines not only survived but thrived because they surfaced only during brief night windows when air patrols were minimal. Commander Samuel Dealey in USS Harder conducted a famous patrol in June 1944, specifically designed to prove American submarines could operate in waters Japanese submarines couldn't. Dealey positioned Harder in Sibutu Passage near the Philippines, an area with constant Japanese air and sea patrol. Harder remained submerged during all daylight hours, typically 14-16 hours. She surfaced only at night in 4-5-hour windows, just long enough to charge batteries and refresh air. This pattern would have been impossible for a Japanese submarine, which would have been forced to surface during daylight within 8-10 hours, immediately exposing itself to the heavy air patrols. Harder conducted this patrol for 17 days, remaining almost exclusively submerged during daylight. During this time, she sank 5 Japanese destroyers, an unprecedented achievement for a single patrol. Dealey's success proved that American submarines could operate with near impunity in waters where Japanese submarines faced certain destruction. Japanese naval intelligence analyzed American submarine operations and noted with frustration that American boats seemed able to disappear for days. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine was based on the assumption that any submarine would be forced to surface within 12 hours maximum. When American submarines stayed down for 40+ hours, it broke the tactical assumptions underlying Japanese ASW strategy. A translated Japanese naval intelligence report from March 1944 stated, "Enemy submarines demonstrate submerged endurance far exceeding our estimates. Anti-submarine forces report target disappearance followed by no surface contact for 24-48 hours, after which submarine reappears in different location. Current ASW tactics based on 8-12-hour search assumption are inadequate. Enemy submarines appear capable of remaining submerged indefinitely." The indefinitely conclusion was wrong. American submarines had limits too, but from Japanese perspective, American endurance seemed unlimited compared to their own capabilities. The human cost of the endurance gap was profound. Japanese submariners were among the most skilled and dedicated in any navy. Their training was rigorous, their courage unquestioned. But they were killed in massive numbers by a technological limitation they couldn't overcome. Lieutenant Commander Machitsura Hashimoto, who commanded several submarines and survived the war, wrote extensively about this in his memoir Sunk. Hashimoto described the constant psychological burden of the 8-hour cycle. "We knew American submarines could remain submerged much longer than we could. This knowledge affected every decision. When hunted, we knew we had perhaps 8 hours before forced surfacing. American submarines knew they could wait days. This made our position psychologically inferior before combat even began. We operated knowing time was against us. They operated with time as their ally." The endurance gap also affected crew selection and retention. Submarine duty was psychologically demanding in any navy, but Japanese submariners faced the additional stress of predictable vulnerability. Every patrol included multiple forced surfacings into potentially hostile conditions. The psychological toll was severe. American submarine crews faced danger too, obviously, but the knowledge that they could control when they surfaced, that they weren't operating on a fixed schedule dictated by technology, provided psychological relief that Japanese crews never experienced. By 1945, the endurance advantage had become so decisive that American submarines operated almost with impunity in areas Japanese submarines couldn't enter. The final year of the war saw American submarines conducting brazen operations that would have been suicide for Japanese boats. Commander Eugene Fluckey in USS Barb conducted multiple patrols in 1945, penetrating into Japanese home waters, the Sea of Japan, coastal waters near Tokyo, even harbors. These operations required remaining submerged for extended periods because Japanese air and sea patrols in home waters were intensive. Barb routinely stayed submerged 40–50 hours, surfacing only during brief safe windows. On her 12th patrol in June–July 1945, Barb penetrated Patience Bay in the Kuril Islands, virtually a Japanese lake with heavy patrol coverage. Barb remained submerged in the bay for 55 hours, the longest submerged period recorded by any American submarine in combat conditions during the war. Fluckey used this extended underwater endurance to avoid detection while waiting for a Japanese convoy he'd been informed was approaching. When the convoy appeared, Barb attacked from perfect concealed position, sank 3 ships, then evaded the counterattack by remaining submerged an additional 18 hours, total time submerged 73 hours. When Barb finally surfaced, Japanese forces had concluded the submarine had escaped the bay and reduced their search intensity. This patrol demonstrated the ultimate expression of endurance advantage. American submarines could penetrate the most heavily defended enemy waters, remain hidden indefinitely, attack at will, and escape. Japanese submarines attempting similar operations were detected and destroyed within days because they couldn't stay hidden during intensive searches. The final statistics of the Pacific Submarine War tell a story where endurance played a decisive but often overlooked role. American submarines sank 1,314 Japanese merchant ships totaling 5.3 million tons, approximately 55% of all Japanese merchant tonnage lost in the war. Additionally, American submarines sank 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, and over 200 smaller warships. This devastating effectiveness resulted from many factors: better torpedoes after fixing the Mark 14 problems, better training, better tactics, superior code-breaking intelligence. But underlying all of it was the ability to remain submerged in hostile waters for extended periods, attacking when opportunities were perfect and hiding when danger was present. Japanese submarines, by comparison, sank 184 merchant ships totaling 907,000 tons, approximately 1/6 the American total. Japanese submarines also sank no major warships and damaged only a few. This effectiveness gap, American submarines were 6 times more effective than Japanese submarines, resulted from multiple factors. But endurance limitation was fundamental. Japanese submarines couldn't patrol persistently in American-controlled waters because they were forced to surface too frequently. They couldn't wait for perfect attack opportunities because battery state forced premature action. They couldn't evade hunters effectively because they had to surface while being hunted. The loss rate differential was equally stark. Japan lost 68% of submarines commissioned. The United States lost 18%. While combat effectiveness differences contributed to this, vulnerability while surfacing was a major factor. Japanese submarines were simply exposed more often, for longer durations, in more predictable patterns. The torpedo and cargo tonnage comparison is telling. American submarines fired approximately 14,750 torpedoes in combat, scoring approximately 4,650 hits, a 31.5% hit rate. They sank 1,314 ships with these hits. Japanese submarines fired approximately 900 torpedoes in combat, scoring approximately 180 hits, a 20% hit rate. They sank 184 ships. American submarines fired 16 times more torpedoes and achieved 55% better hit rates. The endurance advantage contributed to both numbers. American submarines could position more carefully for better shots and could fire more torpedoes because they conducted more longer patrols in enemy waters. The strategic impact of superior submarine endurance extended beyond sinking statistics. American submarines could maintain continuous blockade of Japanese waters because individual boats could remain on station longer without being detected and forced off station by anti-submarine forces. This created an increasingly effective blockade that strangled Japan economically. Japanese submarines couldn't maintain equivalent blockade of American shipping lanes because they were detected and driven off more quickly, and had to return to base more frequently to avoid destruction in heavily patrolled waters. Post-war interrogations of Japanese submarine officers revealed universal recognition that endurance disparity had been decisive. Captain Takeo Mori, former Chief of Staff for Submarine Operations, stated in 1946 interrogation, "American submarine endurance was one of their most significant advantages. Our submarines operated on predictable cycle, submerge 8 hours, surface to charge, repeat. American submarines seemed to have no such cycle. They would disappear for days, then appear unexpectedly. This made our anti-submarine operations frustratingly ineffective and made American submarines far more dangerous predators." The technical reasons for the endurance gap were well understood by Japanese engineers after the war. What frustrated them was that solutions had been theoretically possible, but were never implemented due to resource constraints and doctrinal priorities. Japan could have built submarines with larger battery banks, but this would have required larger hulls, more materials, more construction time, and more cost per boat. Japanese naval doctrine prioritized quantity of submarines and surface performance over extended submerged endurance. This made sense given pre-war assumptions about how submarines would be used, but proved disastrous in actual combat conditions. Japanese engineers had developed advanced air purification systems experimentally, but these were never mass-produced and installed in operational submarines. The technology existed, but industrial capacity was prioritized for aircraft, warships, and other weapons considered more immediately critical. American industrial capacity allowed investment in submarine endurance without sacrificing quantity. The United States built 203 fleet submarines during the war, more than Japan, while also making each submarine more capable through superior endurance systems. American shipbuilding capacity was simply large enough to build both quantity and quality simultaneously. The story of submarine endurance advantage exemplifies the broader pattern of American victory in the Pacific War. Systematic technological advantages made possible by superior industrial capacity, multiplied by doctrinal flexibility that recognized and exploited these advantages. Japanese submarines were individually impressive, longer range, faster surface speed, more powerful torpedoes than American boats in 1941. But these individual advantages couldn't overcome the systematic advantage of being able to hide twice as long, operate in areas Japanese submarines couldn't survive, and control the terms of engagement through patience underwater. Endurance wasn't the only factor in submarine warfare, but it was fundamental. A submarine that could choose when to surface controlled its destiny. A submarine forced to surface on schedule was at the mercy of whatever was happening above when the batteries died. American submariners fought a patient war underwater. Japanese submariners fought a desperate war against the clock. In warfare, patience is often deadlier than aggression, and patience underwater requires the batteries and air systems to support it. The Japanese learned this too late. By the time they understood the scale of American endurance advantage, they lacked the industrial capacity to build submarines that could match it. And by then, American submarines had already won the tonnage war, destroyed the merchant fleet, blockaded the home islands, and proven that in submarine warfare, the boat that can stay down longest stays alive longest. If this story of how technological endurance advantage defeated tactical excellence surprised you, you need to see our other videos uncovering how systematic American advantages won the Pacific War. We document the real stories, not just battles and heroes, but the engineering, production, and systematic thinking that made victory inevitable. Hit subscribe and notification bell for daily deep dives into the technologies and systems that actually won World War II. Every video is meticulously researched using primary sources, technical manuals, patrol reports, and veteran testimony. Comment below what shocked you most. That Japanese submarines could only stay down 8 hours while Americans stayed down 48+ hours. That this difference led to a 6 times effectiveness gap. That 32% of Japanese submarine losses were from being caught surfaced by aircraft. That American submarines could operate in waters where Japanese submarines faced certain death. Subscribe to War Rewind, where we explore how American innovation in seemingly mundane systems like batteries and air scrubbers proved as decisive as any weapon. The real story of World War II isn't just courage and combat, it's systems, engineering, and the patient application of technological advantages that enemies couldn't match. Japanese submarines surfaced every 8 hours because they had to. American submarines surfaced every 48 hours because they chose to. That difference, control versus necessity, decided the Pacific Submarine War before the first torpedo was fired. See you in the next video.